Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome everyone to this session on transforming innovation systems to deliver impacts at scale. We're coming to you live from Edinburgh, Scotland. In this session, we'll be exploring some of the things that are needed to transform public agricultural research for development to support meeting the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. During the session, we'll have live pollings and a question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question and participate in the quiz, you'll need to download the Hoover app. So please see the instructions that are being shown now. To access the app, you'll need to enter the email address that you used to register for the event and create a password. If the event doesn't show up automatically, search for a new era for food and climate, then click the join button on the bottom of the event description page and enter the event invitation code that the organizers sent you. Or you can request a new code that they will send you also. And please don't forget to download a copy of the report, Actions to Transform Food Systems Under Climate Change. And the link is being shown now. That's the bit.ly, bit.ly/action for food. In the session, we'll have a panel discussion with 4 distinguished panelists in which we'll be exploring what we need to do differently in the future, followed by some questions and answers. But to start with, we're going to start with 6 video clips that highlight some of the ways in which people are innovating, reaching and interacting with small-scale farmers in East Africa, a new and exciting technology, feeding cows with seaweed, new partnerships that bring science and policy making closer together in Ghana, new ways to link the private sector with agriculture research in India, innovative ways to reimagine what future food systems might actually look like, and training the next generation of agricultural researchers to be innovators.
Hi, I'm David Campbell, Director of the Media Company. We look at the way media can be used to support education and development, and we were very lucky to work with CCAFs in the early days of our series called Shamba Shape Up, which is a makeover on smallholder farms. We go onto a farm, we say, hey, John, your cow's not looking good. He says he's got problems getting his income for his dairy. We bring in the experts and we try to help him. Every farm we went onto with the reality program, we'd ask farmers what are their problems, and they would say variable weather or an equivalent description, which is basically about climate change. So we got in touch with CCAFs and we worked extremely well with them. On dairy particularly, we were really interested to see how we could get farmers, when the season became drier earlier than usual or were for longer periods than usual, how could dairy farmers continue to keep their production levels up. We got farmers to look at making silage in a very, very simple way, making hay. With dairy, the important thing is when you come to research impact, farmers have the data because they know how many litres of milk they produced. That allowed us to make an assessment, very rigorous piece of research funded by the AECF, which showed that farmers who had made changes directly related to watching the program of Shamba Shape Up, our makeover series, had increased their milk production to a value of $19 million in Kenya over the period of 2 years. But if you look at people who are using improved seeds, which varieties of seed for planting, there are dramatic increases there as well. What's innovative about this is that it's taking the idea of edutainment, getting people educated, but drawing them in by using an entertainment factor. So we worked to develop the first reality show in Kenya, the makeover on smallholder farms. We're in our 10th year. The numbers continue to grow. So there are 10 to 11 million viewers weekly through the growing season that watch Shamba Shape Up. This helps to transform the food system. It was the first time that Kenya was no longer importing milk from Uganda. When people are planting certified seed that's been new varieties developed, we're getting crops that, for example, in maize, that will come to fruition and to harvest in 5 months rather than 7 months. Now, when you've got variable weather, that undoubtedly reduces your risk. Shamba Shape Up, the Makeover TV series, is backed up by iShamba. The one issue that really came up was people calling and he'd said, one of my cows is not well. So we started iShamba, and that's a mobile phone service. People can call into the call center. Most people SMS into the call center, and they get answered within 24 hours.
Hi, I'm Michael Batalia from CSIRO. I want to tell you about an amazing seaweed, Asparagopsis. If we just take one handful of this seaweed and feed it to livestock daily, we not only virtually eliminate livestock methane, but we also increase animal productivity. We can deal with two of the biggest problems of our time at the same time: eliminating livestock methane, a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions, and we can help provide the food we need to meet the growing food gap. This could be a real game changer for the livestock industry. At the moment, we're setting up a company, Future Feed, that's going to be targeting this seaweed into those situations, feedlots and dairies, where animals get a daily fixed ration. In the longer run, we want to do the work to help us get the seaweed out to all those other animals where they don't get that daily ration, but where there's a significant contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions.
I bring to you all greetings from members of the platform in Ghana. The CSA Science Policy platforms appear to have a national character, complementing the work of statutory bodies while building the capacities of its members in the area of climate-smart agriculture actions. Strategically, there is a huge effort at decentralizing the subnational levels to cover more districts from the current 10 platforms. This is to ensure that policies and actions on climate change, agriculture and food system matters are adequately and sustainably handled at the grassroots level as well. Further, this provides us with the opportunity to depart from the business as usual way of doing things. On climate change and environmental matters, national platforms are now able to communicate direct with local policy at the district assemblies and also to national policy through the national platform. By this, national policy literacy on climate change and CSA actions at subnational level is checked. Upstream policy actors benefit from the downstream result outputs in the process. I end my talk here by extending hearty congratulations to you all for the successful launch of the CCAF's Transformation Initiative, under which this particular session is discussing transforming innovation systems to deliver impact at scale.
At the core of all our programs are certain principles that we do not compromise on. One is the building and nurturing of empowered grassroots institutions to plan, execute, and maintain the interventions. Without this, we feel long-term sustainability is not possible. The other thing that we value greatly are multi-stakeholder partnerships. For scale, we partner with governments and Today, we have more than 77 large-scale public-private partnerships in place. ITC's CSA program attempts climate resilient agriculture to ensure food security for farmers and simultaneously create a sustainable and green raw material base for its businesses. The scale is fairly significant. Just last year alone, for instance, we had covered more than 640,000 acres and more than 1 million farmers. Our crop development activities cover more than 10 crops, which include food crops, commercial crops, and horticulture species. At the heart of the CSA program actually is CCAF's model of clustering villages based on their current level of climate resilience. And this is really wonderful and extremely helpful, because what it does is it allows us to design and customize a package of practices that are most appropriate for that particular cluster depending on their current level of resilience. But overall, the impact on farm incomes is what has been most satisfying for us, because the combined impact of all these interventions we have seen again in a single season is a more than 50% increase in net farm incomes for farmers who had been growing wheat, rice, soy, maize, sugarcane and onions. Obviously, scale is not possible unless you partner with the government. And at the heart and core of any success in this area has to come through the creation of empowered, dynamic and robust grassroots institutions.
So, we know that countries from all over the world are making the best of efforts to become resilient to climate change and mitigate its effects. But if we really want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and transform food systems, we need to start to reimagine what food and agriculture could look like in the future. A lot of things could change in the next couple of years. So what challenges might we face and how would we deal with them? We are working with governments in Central America, teaching them how to deal with these future uncertainties in their long-term planning for climate change. Together with civil society and the private sector, they create multiple scenarios of the future and then test their policies to see if they are robust enough to endure these possible future challenges. They then think of backup plans to achieve their goals in case things might turn out differently. One of the things that we have learned is that when this thinking about the future takes place in a participatory way, all the stakeholders involved take their knowledge from the future and use it to make better decisions in the present.
Transformational changes in our food systems to meet the 2030 SDG targets will require greater intersectoral consensus on agreed transformational pathways and goals. This will require greater dialogue and consensus building between the public, private, and civil society sectors. For transformational impacts on our food systems to be realized at scale, there are unlikely to be any, or indeed many, silver bullet solutions arising from individual disciplines. Multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and indeed transdisciplinary approaches within our education systems and beyond are required if we are to generate and scale the innovations necessary to transform our food systems. How can the next generation of young people be equipped with the knowledge and the skills to become effective agents of transformational change? In the interdisciplinary master's degree in climate change, agriculture and food security at the National University of Ireland in Galway, which we run in conjunction with the Global CCAPS programme, we place major emphasis on building on the existing knowledge of our students so that they can gain an understanding of the trade-offs and co-benefits associated with different pathways and approaches to transforming our food systems. The next generation of young people need to be better equipped to deal with the deluge of information and messaging, often contradictory, regarding food systems transformation, so that they can be better enabled to play their part in transformations leading to positive outcomes for both people and planet. For impacts to be realized at scale within the timeframes that we are facing, we also need to scale our education and training systems for food systems transformation in the face of climate change. This requires taking a more systemic view of our education system at all levels by embedding continuous education and learning processes within the public, private, and civil society institutions that can deliver transformational change. We must remember that education is transformational. If we are to transform food systems, we must place greater emphasis within our educational systems on creative thinking and interdisciplinary teamwork. In addition, our educational systems must enable and empower innovators to make positive contributions to our communities, economies, and societies.
Those are just a few of the many great examples of innovation that we need to build on if we are to transform or reconfigure our food system. Before moving on to the next piece, we have two questions that in a mini quiz that we'd like you to think about in the next few minutes. And these are on the Hoover app. So the first question is, how much is spent globally on agriculture research and development in a year? Is it around 8 billion, 30 billion, 69 billion, or $127 billion? And the second question is, by 2025, it is estimated that what percentage of people in sub-Saharan Africa will have their own mobile phone subscriptions? Is it 35%, 40%, 45%, or 50%? So if you go to the Hoover app and pick an answer to each question, we'll show a summary of the results towards the end of the session. And the polls will be open for the next 15 minutes. Now it's my great pleasure to turn to our four distinguished panelists. To start, I'll be asking each of them to speak for just a couple of minutes to give us their perspective on food system innovation and what some of the barriers are to achieving that. Before we start, just to remind you, if you would like to ask a question, again, use the Hoover app and type your question into the app. If you have not already accessed the app, you can do so by following the instructions on the slide. If you need to, please make a note of the details now. So we'll start with you, Mario. Over to you.
Thank you, Philip. Well, innovation will indeed be an essential component for achieving healthy and sustainable diets and for improving food systems in general. We have a great salient example from the Eat Lancet, where most of the people focused on the changes in diets, but to achieve really the healthy and sustainable diets within planetary boundaries, we also needed very significant increases in productivity and also in waste reduction simultaneously with the changes in diets. So this actually shows us that it's a multi-pronged approach, and it's something that we will fundamentally need to tackle. Now, we know that there's many technological options, especially on the production side, but there's enormous barriers to their adoption. For example, cost, input supply. There's things that have been happening for decades, and we haven't managed to move the needles in terms of productivity in many of these places. So perhaps one of the solutions is to also pay more attention to emerging technologies. Emerging technologies will have the problems that they are poorly understood, and therefore we will need a very significant dialogue amongst stakeholders. We will need to develop the trust in the technologies. We will need a very transparent understanding of what their impacts might be. I think it will be really important that we open the breadth of stakeholders that we interact with, simply because a lot of these innovations will not necessarily come from the sector. And we will therefore require an open mind for really opening what we want to achieve in the system. I think that we also need to design very realistic transition pathways. We rarely focus on the how, and it's really all about the how. And if we collectively really work towards understanding better the costs and what it would really take to deploy these emerging technologies, I think that we will achieve some wins in the next 10 years. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mario. Marieke, over to you.
Hi, so I think that transformation is all about changing systems dynamics by looking at things from a different perspective. I'm really impressed by the high level of analysis and long-term planning in my region in Central America for countries to be able to reach their climate and food security goals. And at the same time, the governments we work with also mentioned that they are not sure how to manage the uncertainty that comes with truly ensuring that these goals are met. So we are working closely with them in concrete policy formulation processes, such as the enhancement of MDCs, trying to mainstream what we call scenario-guided policymaking. So what this basically means is that countries are collectively, together with other stakeholders, imagining what could change in the landscape in which countries will implement these climate actions. Because it is, as Mario said, all about the implementation, right? We really need to do concrete things. And to be able to imagine that, we need to be thinking about multiple possible futures and prioritize policies that endure many different changes. So we need to reimagine the relationships between different elements of a system and what drivers could cause these changes. And I think it's really important that this cannot be an expert thing. We need to involve a wide range of stakeholders in these processes, and hopefully not only the good ones, but also the bad and the ugly, the stakeholders that are not really changing things yet, so that they go together through this thinking process and pollinize their ideas and start to do things differently.
That's great. Thank you very much, Marieke. And Charlie, to you now.
Thanks, Phil. So when we consider transforming innovation systems, we really have to ask ourselves to what purpose and goal. We have the 17 SDGs, which have a 10-year time frame to 2030. And if we focus on the food-related SDGs, we really also have to consider that the goals are indivisible and interrelated, which is an important point to keep in mind. And then, like in this session, I think we really need to unpack what we mean by innovation and innovation systems. Innovation really is about better solutions to meet needs, whereas innovation systems is about interactions. It's about the interactions between people, enterprises, institutions, to turn ideas into processes, products, or services. And I think coming back to what Marieke was saying, that innovations aren't really only limited to technology companies and research labs. They also occur at the grassroots level and also at the policy level. So while we might be very good at spotting the formal innovations, we may not be really great at identifying and promoting grassroots innovations or innovations that are happening in a policy sphere. So I feel that we need to focus more on the processes to enable the scaling of innovations of all types. And then in scaling, we also have to consider that if we're scaling innovations, that they won't benefit all end users equally. So the question of socially equitable scaling of innovations, which will be important for just transformations of our food systems. There are billions of dollars of investment per annum in agricultural R&D, priority setting in relation to such investments for transformation. So we need to ask the question in those priority setting spheres, which consumers, farmers, farming systems and countries are going to be winners and losers in terms of food systems transformations. A key point in any transformation will be that we'll need to deliver high quality rural jobs as for future green bioeconomies, and also consider the relationships with social protection systems for any farmers stepping out of agriculture. Then another barrier that I see really is that there are many sectors or groups, let's say, within the agri-food sphere and beyond that are proposing different transformational pathways. And we need more consideration of trade-offs and synergies between the different pathways so that we get better pathway coherence. I think that would be important. Then there are also perceptions that many innovations are lying on the shelf. The lack of effective extension systems are not driving them into the communities. However, this might be true in some instances, but the action report indicates that existing innovations can only deliver about 20 to 40% of needed mitigation. So really that speaks to a need for continuing investment in developing innovations, both fundamental and applied research, to have a pipeline of innovations at different levels of technology readiness. And then while we consider the urgency of, we all can see the urgency of the climate and sustainability challenge regarding food systems, it's important that we don't engage in premature rolling out or scaling out of innovations that aren't really supported by robust evidence. There's a long history of innovations that have been failed to be adopted or had the desired impact. And so we need to be careful in terms of that process. And by involving farmers and end users in the innovation process at the very earliest stages is one way of mitigating that. So the kind of key barriers I see are conflicting narratives and positions between stakeholders regarding what the pathways and innovations should be pursued. And then, looking at a more complete spectrum of innovations, including not just the high-tech ones, but also grassroots innovations, policy innovations. How do we enable that? And then the question around our educational research and innovation systems. The incentive systems within those systems are pretty weak, particularly for driving rapid scaling of innovations. Most education systems or programs lack a clear theory of change or mechanisms for tracking the impact of our graduates once they leave the educational system. And then on the research side, while we're very good at tracking publication outputs, we're less effective at having universal mechanisms to measure research impacts and outcomes. So there's more to be done on that side. Then on the policy side, again, in many countries, for many people, the policy sphere can be seen as a black box where you've got a small policy community that are devising policies with pressures from broader kind of policy networks. So there's a need for greater kind of openness and stakeholder engagement so that innovations can feed into policy processes. And then also on the policy implementing side, how to foster the diffusion of innovations between policy and innovators.
That's great. Thanks very much, Charlie.
Thank you.
Some good points there. And Rachel, over to you.
Great, thanks, Philip. Agriculture research for development is going to be absolutely fundamental to delivering this transition in food systems that the report launched today describes. But as Bruce Campbell said in his opening statement this morning, despite significant achievements, we're just not delivering at the scale or pace needed. Often new technologies and practices don't reach end users, or they're not going to scale. In many cases, climate smart agricultural approaches have been demonstrated, but in relatively limited settings. So whilst the report launched today highlights a range of emerging technologies, whether that's genomics or digital agriculture, or some of the things that we heard about in the videos just now, we urgently need better approaches and better ways of integrating those innovations into the food system so that they deliver the changes needed. But what are the barriers to that? And there are multiple ones, as others have referred to, but I'll just highlight three: finance, risk, and information. So there's a finance gap, a lack of investment in R&D, but that's compounded by a shortage of proven business models and innovative financing mechanisms, which can help bridge that gap between innovation or technology and those doing the research and those able to scale those new approaches. And that often involves the private sector. And funding pipelines don't link the science to the partners who can develop and adopt those products and tailor them to end users. On the risk side, I think as Charles has just referred, we often have weak innovation ecosystems and policy environments, but we're failing to connect those sources of finance, researchers and end users. And that makes adoption of new technologies risky, whether it's risky at the business level to small scale enterprises working along value chains, or whether that's at the farmer level. And that again exacerbates low take up and demand. And the information gap, I think there's two aspects of that. One, there's a gap in enabling farmers to access appropriate tailored advice on new technologies and new approaches. But there's also a gap in enabling policymakers to access the kind of high quality evidence on what works and where in climate smart agriculture. And we need to address that. We need a much better evidence base on the impact and the cost effectiveness of different interventions in different settings.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rachel. There's some very interesting points raised in there, and we'll perhaps in this next little bit of discussion, we'll come back to one or two of those. So, Marieke, perhaps starting with you, you talked about the many potential benefits of new technology. New technology can also be highly disruptive. What do you think is needed I guess particularly in a lower income setting, to try to sort of maximize the potential benefits of new technology for small scale farmers. Sorry.
Oops. We have very good examples of things that have worked at scale from a range of other sectors. Look, for example, at the mobile phones in sub-Saharan Africa, how they were something that was scaled up remarkably quickly. And this necessitated a dialogue between the public and the private industries. It required a concerted action by telecommunications companies to really step in and co-invest with the public sector to make this happen. And I think that that's the kind of model that we will also need for agricultural technologies. Rachel alluded to it. One of the key things will be to ensure that we have the adequate funding models, but from the user's perspective, it is really transparency of the potential impacts of these different technologies that in many cases we don't know well. We need to really evaluate them properly. And this will actually require probably a range of tools that we haven't even started to develop. I think that we really need to start thinking of how we're going to do this seriously in enormous speed, because we cannot take 3 years to do an impact assessment study of a new technology and then expect to have results by 2030. Just imagine. We need to really start building perhaps stakeholder platforms, Delphi systems, a lot more dialogue between stakeholders to make the choices. And yes, some of the choices might not be perfect, but we need to try to continue adapting the solutions as we go, I think.
Thank you very much, Mario. And actually, if I can now come to Marieke, you mentioned something about sort of developing, how do we go about developing visions or a vision for society in terms of what a future food system could look like that's genuinely equitable and environmentally appropriate. How might we go about doing that?
Well, I think it is definitely important that countries in a collective way envision how they would like to see the future. And what we've seen is that it's also important that as a country, and not only as policymakers, but involving other different stakeholders from civil society, from the research arena, and from the private sector, to look at what can go wrong and what can totally change. And what we've seen that when they go through this process of understanding what things might drive changes within the food system, that's when they really start to robust the policies that they're thinking of implementing, the changes that they're thinking of making within their own sector, and to basically to make sure that all these plans that they have will really be implemented in an effective way. We shouldn't only vision what we would like to see, but also anticipate what might go wrong and how to go away with that.
Great, thanks. And Rachel, in the transformation report, it talks about considerably increasing the amount of public investment in agricultural research for development being used to provide end-to-end solutions. In your view, what does this really entail from a practical perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Philip. I think you're right. It's not just about the levels of investment in agriculture R&D, although that's really important, but it's also about the quality and how we deliver research or do research. And I think the report talks about breaking out of our research comfort zone. I think that's a great expression. And there's three aspects to that. And one the report talks about is end-to-end approaches, end-to-end approaches to financing innovation. And that's something that we've been looking at quite a bit in DFID recently. But what does it mean? And I think for us, it means ensuring that the research is really demand-driven, responding to the needs of farmers, practitioners, and policymakers. It also means being really clear on the pathway to development impact and being clear about that right up front in the research process. It probably means rethinking the way in which we measure and incentivize researchers to be user-oriented or to adopt those demand-driven approaches. And I think, as Charles mentioned earlier, it's also about product development pipelines and how do we develop those in a way which assures that products go from early stage finance all the way through to commercialization to avoid that valley of death that we talked about earlier. And so as research institutions and organizations, we need to think about the mechanisms to hand off new technologies and innovation, whether that's drought resilient crops or biofortified crops or other innovations, to the private sector and others who have the incentives to drive for scale.
Thanks very much. Those are great suggestions. Time is getting on, and to wrap up the panel, I'd like to come and pass by each of you for maybe 30 seconds or so on what are you personally going to do differently in the next few months to sort of help this transformation. Mario, can I come to you first again on that? Thanks.
Okay, yeah, I think that from a family perspective, it's about responsible consumption. That's one thing that we're trying to do effectively, reducing the consumption of animal source foods, and also handle waste more effectively, or try to minimize it completely. We already have solar, and that helps a lot. And now, thanks to COVID, I don't have to travel, which is also fantastic. And I hope that we can keep that happening.
Thanks, Mario. Marieke, how about you?
Well, I think Mario and I are in the same league, in the sense that I'm lobbying very hard in my family to make sure that we eat less meat, which is not always easy with children, but really trying to do that in a creative way and make sure that we make that happen. And I think that within our work, something that I've always loved about working with CCAFs is that our work is very much science-based. But we also have to make sure that the work that we do is based on the needs of governments. So we always try to engage and make sure that we are addressing those needs. And something that's sometimes difficult is to also find time and resources to actually share what we've been learning in these different processes, since we are really working on very innovative, addressing things in a very innovative way. So what I've been trying to make sure is that our funders also give us time to be able to do research on what we've been learning and to share that research with others.
That's great, thank you. Charlie, what about you?
So I guess on our side, our family, like many others, are doing our best to undergo a dietary and energy transition, and to, I suppose, join the effort if you want. Then within our institution, we're keen to strengthen the links between our research and education activities, and particularly with partners that can deliver impacts at scale, and very interested in trying to connect to continuous learning within institutions, scaling education and continuous learning processes. And finally, our university and many others are framing their activities increasingly around the SDGs, and that provides a useful framework for more goal-oriented activities, education, about research in the university sector.
That's great, thank you. And Rachel?
Yeah, thanks. Two things, I guess. One is that within DFID and the agriculture research work that we're doing at the moment, we're really focused on how we prioritize our agriculture R&D, making sure that we focus on the biggest global challenges, and how we align our resources around that kind of mission-driven approach and bring others around that agenda. And I think the report is really helpful in setting out the future research questions and the future research challenges in a way that we can all mobilise ourselves around. And secondly, we're thinking about how we can use the time between now and the COP next year to mobilise stakeholders around this new vision for agriculture R&D, how we can encourage that greater prioritisation, stimulate new investments, get alignment between ourselves and others, and really deliver those new partnerships and models for scaling that we really urgently need.
That's great. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes just for one or two questions from you, the audience, and we have a nice set of questions here. We're not going to be able to get through all of them, but let's take one or two. So there's a question here around, isn't it time to rethink the system towards closed innovative systems and have more local production in the form of urban indoor farming? Would anybody like to comment on that one? Mario, go ahead.
I could possibly comment on that. Yes, absolutely. We need to include those kinds of systems, but we also need to be. I don't think that we have the luxury that we might have had a few decades back when we could have chosen a few set of things that would be widely adopted. I think that the challenge is so big at the moment that we really need to think of how all these kinds of interventions will contribute. Of course, all will have a time and a place. We really need to keep the portfolio very open because we will need multiple entry points for this very problem that we're having now.
Thanks. Charlie, did you want to add to that quickly?
Yeah, just very quickly, like I think urban farming has major potential, but we should be careful not to see it as a substitute for open field farming. We're going to, as Mario says, we're going to need everything. Given the urgency, the time scale, and the challenge that's there, you need a broad portfolio of things that need to be deployed both in urban and rural settings.
Okay, thank you. And another question here, in the current scenario, how do you see models of funding and capacity development support for agriculture innovators in developing economies? How do you see these changing as we go into the future? Would anybody like to make a couple of comments on that one? Marieke, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we definitely have to be very creative in terms of funding. Something that we've noticed in the last few years is that there is actually quite a big need, a gap between what governments and policymakers need, and on the one hand, and what the support that is available from MFOs or from big funders for these governments. So what we've been doing is to engage a conversation between the two to be able to fund our work. So I believe that that's actually been working quite well. And I think it also addresses the need to make sure that our research is something that's needed, something that countries will use, and something that's will then have an impact in society.
That's great. Thank you very much for that. I think we're now coming towards the end of our session. Before we finish, it's time to take a quick look at the interactive question results. And so in terms of the amount of dollars that are spent annually on agriculture research and development, we can see that the most popular answer is in fact overestimating it. So most of you thought that 69 billion, and actually it's much nearer to 30 billion. So in a way that's quite surprising because it's not, in the big scheme of things, it just highlights the fact that we need to be very efficient in expending those research resources. And the second question, it's estimated that 50% of people in sub-Saharan Africa will have their own mobile phone subscriptions by 2025. And about half of you got that right. And And of course, we can see that such a level of connectivity in sub-Saharan Africa obviously offers huge opportunities for producers and for consumers alike. So thank you for your participation in the quiz. And just to summarize, if I may, in two very quick points. One is around the role of research for development, which has a huge role in helping to make our food systems better able to produce the quantity and the quality of food needed to feed what is, after all, a growing world population. But of course, we have to do this in a way that satisfies nutritional needs, benefits everyone equally and equitably, and minimizes the negative impacts on the environment. And I think the other important point is, and our panelists have highlighted this very well, every one of us is an agent in the global food system, and we all have roles that we can play in helping to reconfigure it. Some of us grow and process food. Some of us make the seeds and feed that are needed to grow it. Some of us research and teach people about it, or we frame regulations and trade policies around it, or deliver and sell it. But the fact is that all of us eat food, and there are huge opportunities for innovating in all of these areas. It may seem that individual changes in our behavior may not amount to very much, but collectively, they can add up to move our food system towards where it needs to be for the benefit of everyone. So it just remains for me to say a big thank you to all our video makers and our panelists, and a big thank you to you, the audience, for participating in our session. And we hope that you will join us for the next session, which is on supporting prosperity through mobility and rural reinvigoration, that will be hosted from Bamako, Mali. And that one starts in 15 minutes' time. So thank you all very much, and goodbye.